Sword or gun? Why not both? Well, clearly these two things existed in the same period of history and were used together. But an interesting question comes up. If you have a pistol and you have a sword, which do you use first? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria and Easton Antique Arms. Now I've got two contemporary weapons here. One is a flintlock pistol made by Joseph Clarkson of London in about 1730, and this is a also London-made silver-hilted English small sword, gentleman's dueling sword essentially, but also self-defense sword, sometimes carried in military life, from about 1723. In fact, it's hallmarked 1723. So these two items absolutely could be carried together in civilian context, for travelling, for self-defence, or indeed occasionally taken abroad or taken on campaign. Now, I think a lot of people out there think that once guns came along, swords were superfluous. And of course, regular watchers of this channel will know from a multitude of previous videos I've done that this is complete and utter rubbish. Firearms were used as weapons since the 13th century. And by the 16th century, that is the 1500s, pistols existed. Things like wheel locks, for example, precursors to this flintlock here. But pistols existed, single shot pistols, very occasionally multiple shot, we'll talk about that in a second, but single shot pistols existed from the 1500s onwards. That's a really long time, and swords were still being used regularly in warfare throughout the 1800s. So really we're talking here about a good solid 350 years where swords and pistols were around at the same time. Now, without going into huge depth, because I have covered this in previous videos, fundamentally the reason was because these are slow to load, slow to reload as well, usually single shot. Again, I'll come back to multi-shot pistols in a second, or multiple pistols. So you only got one shot for most people in most of history throughout the 16th, 17th, 18th and 19th century, at least the first half of the 19th century. Most people have only got one shot, so therefore things like swords or bowie knives and other things are really, really important for self-defense or in military life, because you might not have the chance or ability or time or space to reload. So if you've only got one shot, the question is, do you use the edged weapon, or the hand weapon rather, the cold steel weapon first, or do you use the pistol first? Well, this was in fact a massive debate at the time. Throughout the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, until multi-shot pistols like this cap and ball muzzle loading, or at least front of the cylinder loading, multi-shot, in this case 5-shot revolver. So this dates to about 1855 and is a contemporary of lots of the sabres that I show on this channel. So this is a Wilkinson Coldstream Guards officer's sabre dated to 1855, and this pistol also dates to about 1855. So these are exactly the sorts of swords and pistols that would have been carried in the Crimean War, or indeed things like the Indian Mutiny, or the Taku Forts campaign in China in 1860, for example, and things like this. So middle of the 19th century, or indeed the American Civil War, cap and ball revolvers were very prevalent, as were sabres. However, these were a new thing. Obviously, the Colt revolvers are the most famous, and they were also used by the British as well as the Americans and various other people, French and so on. But even in the time of this, lots of people still only had single shot or sometimes double shot pistols. Now, I did mention that I would talk about multi-shot pistols. Well, so at the same time that we have these single shot muzzle loading pistols, you also sometimes have double barreled ones, sometimes over and under, sometimes side by side. You even occasionally have turnover barrels, so you shoot one, then you swivel it around and shoot the other. Sometimes you have even 4-barreled or multiple barreled pistols, and yes indeed early forms of revolver did exist in the flintlock age, but we'll discount those because they weren't really, they were more or less experimental. So we did have multi-shot pistols, and that obviously changes the nature of the question, because if you've got your sword and your pistol and you've got more than one shot, your question now is, well, do I use one shot, then use the sword and keep one shot? and so on and so forth. And clearly once revolvers come along, it's a completely different question because you've now got 5 or 6 shots. But bear in mind, these can miss, these can malfunction. These are far less reliable than modern cartridge, semi-automatic pistols and things like this. Far less reliable, far more that can go wrong with them. And remember that at the time, people didn't shoot with modern stances. They shot with extended arms, either in Bisley stance, for example, with this Webley, or with extended arms, and sometimes with the offhand, especially if they've got a sword in the other hand at the same time. And in fact, very occasionally, as one example I know of Von Tempsky's Rangers, for example, fighting in the New Zealand land wars in the middle of the 19th century, and they actually had Colt revolvers they put in their right hand, and they actually had a Bowie, don't have a Bowie knife to hand, hilariously in here, but they used Bowie knives in their left hand for blocking Maori weapons so that they could then use their revolver at point blank range. So the question comes back. Let's assume we're now down to single shot pistols, to keep it clean and simple for the purposes of this video, and swords. Which do you use first? What would you, before I give you the pluses and minuses, the advantages and disadvantages, what would you use first? But here are the 3 situations. One is, it's a one-on-one fight with one antagonist. That's the first scenario. The second scenario is it's a potentially multiple opponent scenario. So it could be a skirmish, it could be a brawl in a bar in the Wild West, but this kind of situation where there might be more than one attacker. Okay, and finally, the final example we're going to talk about is war. We'll talk about both on foot and on horseback. So, do you use the pistol first? Do you use the sword first? So where you have one opponent or one assailant, one dangerous person, and there's no other people around, I think most people, we chatted about this on the Facebook page. If you don't follow us on the Facebook page, the link is down below. So I posted something up earlier today, and most people are of the opinion that fighting at sword range against an opponent with swords is highly risky and could get you injured. If you have the ability and the option and the choice to, then it is the best thing to do to shoot the opponent with the gun, and then if needs be, you can finish them off with the sword. That has many advantages to it because, of course, assuming you hit them, they are now wounded, okay, and so they'll be easier to defeat with the sword, and you don't have to go through the risk and randomness of a sword fight. The disadvantage: you might miss. Okay, now if you are deciding to shoot at them, it is presumably out of sword range. The old 21-foot rule, remember that. So bear in mind that if you are shooting at someone, yes, you can parry with a sword. As I often say, you can't parry with a pistol, although we'll come to that in a second, because you actually kind of can, although it's not great at it. So if I shoot someone, let's assume that they are at least 10 feet away, certainly out of sword reach, possibly 20 feet away. So there is a good chance, especially if I think they might run at me, that I've got my sword in my right hand, because I need to be ready to fight them. Now, I'm kind of ambidextrous, so I could use a sword in my left hand if I needed to, but I wouldn't choose to against a really dangerous opponent. I'd use it in my dominant hand, which for me is my right hand, even though I write with my left hand, weirdly. So therefore, I've got my pistol in my left hand, which hopefully I've practiced shooting left-handed, and I will shoot at them and hope I hit them. But if I fail to, they are now coming at me and I now have my sword. Great. But bear in mind that because of the distance, there is a good chance I will miss. So I think in a one-on-one scenario, most people were agreed that they would rather shoot first, use the sword second. However, why might I choose not to do that? Well, if I was a confident swordsman and I look at the opponent, or I know anything about them, and I think that I can take them in a sword fight, but I have a pistol, and it's not a duel situation, this isn't fair, I'm playing dirty here, then it might be within my benefit to go in at sword distance and keep the pistol in reserve here, ready to shoot because now I actually stand a much better chance of shooting them because I am that much closer. So coming into sword range with the sword first, I can be fencing them and dealing with their attacks and either think, well, I can keep the shot here should I need it for some other situation and finish them with the sword anyway. Or I can get them into a situation where I've parried them, I've got close to them in whatever way, and at that point I can present the pistol and shoot them because I will be much more close and therefore much more likely to hit them. The bullet is more likely to have a greater effect and all of this kind of stuff. So there is in fact, even if you intend to use the pistol, a good reason why you might choose to go in with the sword first. Now, let's talk about the multiple opponent situation. So as you might realise, the multiple opponent situation is completely different. And in fact, if we go to the Crimean War, revolvers were highly lauded because they had the capacity to deal with not just one or two opponents, but up to 5 or 6 of them, depending whether it was a Adams, a Webley or a Colt or whatever, and how many chambers you still had loaded because you might have used some of them earlier on. But let's remove revolvers out of the mix because that kind of complicates things. So let's remove the multiple shot ones and come back to a single shot pistol. So in a multiple opponent situation, so again, this could be, you could be, bandits, highwaymen, this could be a fight in a Wild West town, this could be boarding an enemy ship, this could be a skirmish on foot, whatever, okay? It could be traveling and you've been attacked by bandits, whatever. So you've got a single shot pistol on a sword. So there is a Lieutenant William Pringle Green who wrote a treatise in 1812, I think it was, and he was a Royal Navy officer during the Napoleonic Wars, and he wrote various things about how to use weapons and general fighting advice aboard ships fighting against the French and the Spanish, who were our opponents in 1812, as were the Americans as well. Let's not talk about that. One of the advice that he gave was to keep the shot until, well, there's various options basically. So to keep the shot until later. Now, the reason that this might be advisable is because if you're taking on people with your sword, or cutlass in this case, you're taking on people with your sword, then if you come up against an opponent who you find too much to handle, then you've got your shot in reserve. Whereas if you go in with the pistol from the outset, yeah, okay, let's say you hit someone, you shoot someone, you take them out of action. You've taken one opponent out of action, but let's say that the opponent's ship, or whoever you're fighting, let's say there's 10 potential opponents and you've got other people fighting alongside you. You don't know how many people you're going to end up facing and you've only got a single shot pistol. So yes, okay, you take one person out, but for all you know, because you don't know how good they were at fighting, you could have easily taken that person out with your sword and kept that shot for that far better swordsman you're going to have to face later. So it's very clear there is an advantage to keeping your shot until things are going horribly wrong as a last-ditch self-defense. Obviously, multiple pistols. Someone on the Facebook page mentioned Teach, Blackbeard, for example, had multiple pistols and a couple of swords. Absolutely. If you can have multiple pistols, clearly that's an advantage, and that's the equivalent of a revolver, and that's clearly the direction that pistols went in eventually. But for now, let's just assume you've only got one shot. So, yes, absolutely, keeping a shot back until you really need it could have all sorts of advantages. You could be in the middle of fighting someone and initially you thought you could take them with a sword, and you start to realise that you're losing this fight. Well, at that point you can pull your pistol out, or if you've already got it in your hand, shoot them, okay? So there's an advantage to keeping it back. However, as mentioned, there is an advantage to shooting first because you've reduced the opponents by 1 instantly, whether you kill or incapacitate, whatever, okay? So, bang, okay, now I've got fewer opponents to deal with and I might be more advantaged in that sense with my sword. But there is another factor to bear in mind, and again, this is covered in Pringle Green's manual treatise. So, this is that once this pistol is expended, you can turn it around and use it as either a blocking device or a hitting device. And we absolutely know that these sorts of pistols, and in fact others, okay, even later on, even revolvers and stuff, were sometimes used as little tomahawk club type things. Now, they're not terribly strong. It's not really what they're designed for, and you're likely to break them in the process. However, if you're up against opponents with relatively light swords, like the small sword, even at a push, something like a saber, then absolutely sticking this in the way to parry at the same time as attacking could be really, really useful. So it becomes a bit like rapier and dagger technique. So absolutely you can do that. The other option that's recommended is actually to lay it down your forearm there, which gives it more support and means you're parrying with the barrel instead of with the wood. So another option is to fence as you would do normally, but you can parry cuts with that barrel, or potentially even push thrusts off a side at the same time as putting your own thrust in. So these can be used as parrying devices. And obviously holding them backwards like this, you would want them to have been fired first because you wouldn't want it going off in your hand. So one other advantage of shooting first is that you can now turn this around, or in whatever way, holding it that way or holding it that way, and use it as a blocking or commanding and controlling device. In other words, a lump of wood and metal, rather than as a firearm. So there are advantages both ways. What would you choose in that situation? If you're boarding an enemy ship, fighting a bunch of opponents in a Wild West town, or indeed fighting on a battlefield, what would you choose? Would you shoot first, ask questions later, and use your sword? Or would you use the sword for as long as possible and then shoot? What would you choose? So the final scenario we're going to look at here is military. And in fact, there was some interesting discourse between some people on the Facebook page with some information I hadn't seen before. And that was that different doctrine in different militaries was different. Surprise, surprise. Now, obviously, if you're a soldier, a lot of what you do, just the same in the modern day, even back in the 1700s or 1800s, a lot of what you do isn't necessarily your personal choice. It's what you've been taught to do, what you've been drilled and trained to do, okay? And in some cases, if you went against that, you might be brought up on a court-martial because you're there to fight. Certainly if you're something like a cavalry trooper, maybe not an officer so much, but if you're a cavalry trooper, you're there to do what your commanding officer has told you to do, or perhaps even what the state has decreed by regulation that you do, okay? So say, for example, you're a cavalry trooper. Now, cavalry traditionally had swords and firearms of various types. Some had a carbine, some had pistols, some had a brace or pair of pistols, and of course some had lances as well as firearms and swords, okay? But let's just talk about the sword and the pistol here, which were probably the most common armament of cavalry throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, and 17th as well. So, one option is to use the pistol, keep the sword sheathed, use the pistol as you charge in. So in this case, you're using it a bit like a lance. You're charging at the enemy. When you get close enough to hit something, you're shooting with either one or both pistols, or the carbine if you're using a carbine. And so you're hitting the enemy before you physically hit them. The disadvantage of that is once you've fired your pistol, you don't have any ability to reload until you've gone away somewhere and found some safe space to do so. So once you've fired your pistols, you pretty much have to wheel around and ride away. You can't really charge home with an empty pistol, okay? You will only hit one opponent. If you're very lucky, I guess it might go through one person and into another, but by and large, bang, that's it. Okay, if you've got two pistols, it's bang, bang. They might hit, they might not. What do? Carry on riding at the enemy? I don't know. So a sword is very important at this point for two main reasons. One, because a sword can keep offending the enemy repeatedly, over and over and over again until your arm gets tired. But also very importantly, it can defend against their attacks. Bayonets, pikes, other swords, whatever. Okay? Can't really do that with a pistol on horseback. I mean, maybe, but not really. Okay, so very important that the sword is used at some point. So what you might do, for example, because you want time if you're charging towards enemy, you might pull your pistols out and shoot, or one or two of them, pull your pistol out and shoot at, let's say, 40 yards away, and then quickly either drop it or drop it into the kind of holster you have on the side of the saddle, and draw your sword out so you can still charge home with the sword, cutting or thrusting, whichever you prefer, after you've fired your pistol. So you can use both as you go in. But once you get into the melee, if you'd fired your pistol, you only have the sword. Now, apparently, there were some militaries that told you to do the exact opposite. They actually told you, rather than charging in and shooting as you went, and then pulling the sword out to fight with, they taught you to charge in with the sword alone, so you hit the enemy with the swords, you went in with the swords, and then pull the pistol out and administer some death-dealing shots at close range where you were more likely to hit and wound and incapacitate. So, two schools of thought. You either go with the pistol first or you go with the sword first, and both were done and both were preferred by different militaries. My understanding is that the Prussian military taught you to go in with the sword first and use the pistol second, whereas some other militaries were the other way around. Right, so fighting on foot. Again, this is assuming it's a single shot pistol. It's exactly the same situation to the multiple opponent one. You can either keep your shot for when you're really hard pressed and you need it, or you can reduce the enemy's numbers by 1 and then you're stuck basically with a sword because you can't realistically reload this once you're in close combat. So there we go. What would you do in these different scenarios? I think it's a pretty interesting question, and just once again, obviously once we start to bring revolvers into the mix, it makes it a somewhat easier question to answer because I've now got 5 shots. I can shoot first, then I can go in with my sword, I can shoot again, and I can make sure, so long as I'm counting my shots, I can even make sure that I keep 1 or 2 shots for when things are going really bad, just in case. But I can still shoot first, cut second, shoot third, and so on and so forth. So I can mix the things up in a more complex way with multiple shot pistols or multiple pistols. One final thing I want to say is some people talk about the multiple pistols thing as a sort of trump card, okay? And it's not, for a couple of reasons, in my opinion. One is, in the age of flintlocks and these types of essentially single shot pistols, yes, Blackbeard might have carried 6 pistols, which sounds, wow, he had 6 pistols. So the same number of shots as 1 revolver then. Okay, it's actually not that much, especially when you consider that of those 6 shots, at least some of them are going to miss or not have the desired effect. So actually 6 pistols is a lot to carry and is only 6 shots, which is only 6 attacks, essentially. How many attacks do you get with the sword? Unlimited, until you get tired, basically. So, single shot pistols, 6 pistols actually isn't as much of a game changer as you might think in a battlefield situation. Obviously in a one-on-one situation it would be. Once you get to revolvers, so it is often mentioned on the internet that, for example, the Confederate cavalry in the American Civil War sometimes carried multiple revolvers. I think this was rare. I've actually looked for evidence of this, and there is some, but it was rare. And one of the main reasons is the Confederates didn't have much of anything. One of the main reasons the Confederates didn't use a lot of swords was because they didn't have access to a lot of swords. In some cases, there was only 1 sabre between 3 men. It wasn't that they didn't want to use sabres and drive home cavalry charges, they couldn't because they didn't have the swords available, because all the factories were in the north, in the Union-held territories. So in many cases, the Confederate cavalry ended up with things like shotguns and stuff because that's what they had. Now, revolvers at this time were a relatively new invention and pretty expensive. Single-shot pistols were still being used in the American Civil War, and so not many people would have been able to afford multiple revolvers. Many people couldn't even get 1 revolver, let alone multiple revolvers. So I think too much is made of this. But secondly, this is the other reason that I think this is not this much of a game changer. Let's say you've got 4 revolvers. That's a lot of shots. So let's say they're Colts, Colt Dragoons, Colt Navies. So you've got 6 shots. You've got 4 of them, so you've got 24 shots, okay? That sounds like a huge amount, okay? But first of all, a lot of those 24 shots from horseback, bumping up and down, riding around, are not necessarily going to hit what you're aiming at or even incapacitate what you do hit, okay? But secondly, you still can't necessarily drive home a cavalry charge against people who are armed with various forms of hand weapon, like bayonets or swords or whatever. And of course, all the infantry had bayonets on the end of their muskets. Yes, you can shoot a load of people, but you can't parry with pistols. So swords, even at this period, even if you have a bunch of revolvers, are still very useful and still very important for driving home attacks and holding ground. Because let's say you go in with your four revolvers, once those are emptied, your cavalry, so you're less numerous than the infantry always, let's say you take some ground, how do you hold the ground? You don't have time to reload your Remingtons or your Colts. How do you hold the ground if you don't have hand weapons? And some people would argue this was the problem for Custer at Little Bighorn, because of course he was swarmed by Native Americans using rifles and modern weapons, as well as things like tomahawks and war clubs and stuff. And Custer's force didn't have their sabres, they only had firearms. So once the ammunition ran out, there we go, sitting ducks. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I'd still be interested to see down below. In a single shot pistol, obviously revolvers blow it wide open, so to speak, but in a single shot world, in those three scenarios, would you shoot first and use the sword second? Would you do both at the same time? Or would you use the sword until you really needed to use the pistol? Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton. I will hopefully continue being, and I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.